Welcome to This Explainer. We're going to skip the usual pleasantries today because honestly, we need to drop you right into a moment of just pure suffocating tension. Picture this. The year is 1991. The country is India. And the stakes? Literally the survival of a billion people.
Okay, let's dive into this. 3. That's the terrifying number we're starting with today. Back in 1991, India wasn't just metaphorically struggling, it was actually literally bankrupt. The entire nation had only enough foreign reserves left to pay for exactly 3 weeks of imports. Just 3 weeks. I mean, think about what that actually means for a nation of that immense size. Seriously, once those 3 weeks were up, nothing. Zero. Planes would literally stop refueling. Essential medicines would just stop arriving. The lights across the entire subcontinent would go out. It was a ticking clock. And right in the middle of this absolute chaos, amidst sweating politicians and empty store shelves, this completely unexpected figure emerges. A soft-spoken economist, an accidental finance minister, who barely raises his voice above a whisper, stands up. The whole world fully expects him to fail. But to understand how he didn't, we've got to rewind a bit.
So let's look at part 1, Born in the Dust. Now, what's really interesting about this is that to truly grasp the massive weight of that 1991 crisis, we need to look at how this incredibly quiet spine was forged. Born way back in 1932 in Gah, which is a village now located in Pakistan, he used to walk miles to school completely barefoot, studying by the light of a kerosene lamp. But his real turning point wasn't some fancy promotion. It was a total disaster. The 1947 partition. His family lost absolutely everything and had to cross into India as refugees. Now, most people would break when they lose their home and their safety overnight. But instead of breaking, young Manmohan Singh did something kinda strange. He completely retreated into books. He realized that hate and borders just destroyed logic, so he made this conscious decision to understand money. He genuinely believed that money, if managed right, could actually stop wars and give people dignity. And that intense drive, it pushed him all the way to winning scholarships at Cambridge and Oxford.
But this immense, unbreakable resilience really came from his mother. She was a devout woman with no formal education, but she gave him this single defining rule to live by. Never beg, never complain, work harder than everyone else. And as you'll see, that one lesson became the absolute rock-solid foundation for a man who started with literally nothing, but would eventually face down the richest nations and the most powerful political forces on the planet.
Moving on to part 2, the 1991 revolution. All right, let's fast forward back to that terrifying tipping point in 1991. The economy is totally choking, and Prime Minister Narasimha Rao does the unthinkable. He appoints this shy technocrat as finance minister. The press literally laughs at him. But to understand why India desperately needed a revolution, we really have to talk about the license Raj. India was suffocating under this system where you practically needed government permission just to breathe. I mean, it could take 2 years of mind-numbing paperwork simply to start a business. The economy was essentially a cow that had just stopped giving milk. You combine that bureaucratic chokehold with an oil price spike from the Gulf War and the total collapse of India's biggest ally, the Soviet Union, and you've got a country that nobody in their right mind would lend a single dollar to. So what does Singh do? He locks himself in a room with a small team and drafts a completely secret budget. Then, on July 24th, 1991, he stands up in Parliament, and even though he's trembling inside, he delivers his words in this steady, quiet whisper. He quotes Victor Hugo, saying, "No power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come." And with that one sentence, he drops a policy bomb that completely shatters 40 years of strict Indian economic tradition. Let's move to how this builds, because in rapid succession, he implements 4 incredibly drastic steps. First, he devalues the rupee. He aggressively opens the gates to foreign investment. He officially ends the license Raj. And finally, he slashes import tariffs. So what was the reaction? Well, the old guard just absolutely explodes. Opposition MPs were literally physically tearing up copies of his speech right there in the chamber. They called him a traitor, a puppet of the West who was selling India's soul. But Singh? He didn't shout back. He simply went home, had a quiet dinner with his family, and just waited for the results. Which brings us to part 3, the price of silence. Now, you know how history books often kind of soften reality, right? Well, the sources make it clear that Manmohan Singh was not a perfect man, nor was he a street fighter. And this brings us to the more complicated, definitely darker periods of his political career. In 2004, he reaches the absolute pinnacle of Indian politics, becoming the very first Sikh prime minister. The whole world celebrated. Yet, behind the scenes, the texts describe him as practically a prisoner inside his own government. Trapped by the messy nature of coalition politics, he was reportedly blackmailed by his own allies and openly defied by his own ministers. The guy who had busted the economy wide open was now boxed in by the very political machine he was supposed to be leading.
And this dynamic led to his absolute harshest criticisms. The word thrown at him repeatedly was Mauni, which translates to the silent one. Critics argued that he spoke like an economist, but ruled like a ghost, and they pointed directly to his perceived failures to speak out during monumental crises. For example, when the horrific Gujarat riots occurred in 2002, just before his term, he said very little afterward. And later, when massive corruption scandals like the 2G spectrum scam and the coal block allocations exploded right within his own cabinet, he was fiercely accused of just looking away, of essentially being a mere puppet for the party's top leadership. So, the crucial point is how he actually responded to this overwhelming tidal wave of criticism. In a super rare, surprisingly emotional press conference years later, he offered this one defense. "I honestly believe that history will be kinder to me than the contemporary media." He wasn't necessarily out there defending his specific decisions, you know? It was more like he was hoping and praying that people would one day look back and truly understand the political cage he was trapped inside.
That leads us to part 4, a whisper that echoes. And this brilliantly illustrates the long-term impact. If we pivot past all that political noise, the daily shouting, and the constant outrage, we're left with the hard, totally undeniable data of what his policies actually achieved. Before 1991, India was completely stuck at a sluggish 3.5% growth rate. But after his reforms took root, it skyrocketed to between 7 and 9%. A closed economy completely blossomed into the tech startups, the call centers, and the massive software boom that practically defines modern India today. But the biggest takeaway here? 50 million people were lifted out of extreme poverty. The entire modern Indian middle class was basically born. And all of this was fundamentally seeded by that shy economist in the blue turban who stood up back in 1991. Furthermore, the sources portray him as an entirely unconventional politician. I mean, he actively gave credit away. When the highly controversial and historic U.S. nuclear deal succeeded, he thanked everyone else. When landmark food security legislation was passed, he literally went and sat in the back row. He didn't want giant statues or grand monuments dedicated to himself. His ultimate goal was just stability. He wanted to build a country where a barefoot boy from a dusty, forgotten village could actually grow up to be the prime minister. Because, of course, he was exactly that boy.
All of which makes his exit from power so incredibly poignant. On his very last day as prime minister in 2014, there was no massive fanfare, no grand parade. A journalist just shouted out, asking him how he wanted to be remembered. He turned, smiled, kind of sadly, and simply said, "I did my best, that is all." Then he just got into a white car and drove away. He never wrote some juicy tell-all memoir. He never started a massive flashy foundation in his name. He just went right back to his simple life of reading books and meeting students, still speaking in that same quiet whisper.
In an era that's completely dominated by the roar of populism, constant outrage, and just nonstop political chaos, his legacy stands as this super stark contrast. And it forces us to ask this lingering question: do you really have to shout to change the world? Or is it possible that you just have to be right and brave and kind, and then when the job is done, simply drive away?